For joining us for the first webinar in this series hosted by the Learning Collaborative to Advance Normative Change, titled, Is the Juice Worth the Squeeze? Insights from Applying Theory to Norms-Aware Programming. In today's webinar will be recorded and posted online after the event. Today we'll be reflecting on social norms in health promotion programs through this old adage. Again, is the juice worth the squeeze? We're all aware that designing and implementing social norms programming is important to achieve lasting behavior change, and that it can be also very labor intensive once we do it. But when you put in all of the work, what are the benefits of employing a norms-aware lens to programming? Are these interventions more effective in shifting harmful norms and associated behaviors of interest we are trying to work around or to address? In today's webinar, we'll build on the knowledge and guidance outlined in the recent Learning Collaborative publication called Social Norms and Adolescent and Youth Sexual and Reproductive Health, Building a Bridge from Theory to Program Design. This is a very useful resource for program practitioners that provides guidance for effective intervention design based on the most recent advances in social norms theory and evidence. Our speakers will share key insights and guidance for practitioners interested in designing social norms aware or informed interventions, and we'll hear how two specific projects applied these insights to their work during design and implementation. So I'm very excited to introduce you a great panel of experts for today's webinar, and let me briefly introduce them. I'm Clara Aleman again. I'm a gender and gender-based violence consultant with the Prevention Collaborative. Lori Heise will start us off. She's a professor of social epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She also serves as a technical director of the Prevention Collaborative, a new global initiative designed to support evidence-based gender-based violence prevention programming in the Global South. Lori will be giving us an overview of social norms. Then Ben Chislagi, associate professor from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, will walk us through a conceptual framework used to understand how norms interact with multiple factors influencing behavior. He will also discuss features of norms which help understand them in their context and how these may support or facilitate norms shifting work. And then in the second half of the webinar, we learn from two social norms aware projects in India. One will be presented by Parinita Bhattacharjee, Senior Technical Advisor at the University of Manitoba. She will describe the Samatha project's experience, focusing on how understanding social norms enabled to provide mid-course corrections during implementation. Then Sunita Menon, Senior Director of Content and Design from Breakthrough, will describe the experience of Belle Bajao, who you might have heard of, in applying social norms from the start. So let me tell you briefly about the intervention that brings us today together. The Learning Collaborative to Advance Normative Change is an effort funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with support from USAID through the Passages Project. The Learning Collaborative envisions a world where the powerful influence of social norms in shaping adolescents' lives is widely understood. This collaborative is comprised of three learning communities. The first on social norms theory, which is the one who organizes this webinar today. The second on measurement, and the third one on scale-up of normative interventions. For more information, you can visit the collaborative's link, you can see it at the bottom of this slide. So as you can see, we have three objectives in this webinar. First, to understand the role of social norms in health and behavior change. Second, to explore important features of social norms and their influence on program design. And third, to discuss how norms-aware programming influences program design and implementation and can ultimately contribute to the adoption of new behaviors and shared belief. So before we get started, I wanted to I'll let you know we'll have enough time for questions and answers at the end. So please feel free to submit your questions via the chat box in the corner of your screen. We'll collect your questions throughout and share them with our panelists at the end. So please indicate if there's anybody specifically to which you are asking the question, and we'll direct it to them. So now, again, let me tell you 2 words about our speakers as I introduce each of their terms. Lori Heise has over 25 years of experience working in the areas of gender equity, social change, and women's economic and social empowerment. Her current work focuses on research on preventing violence against women and children in the family and transforming gender norms. Lori, the floor is yours. Lori?
Okay, hi, sorry.
Hi, no problem. We can hear you now.
I didn't unmute myself. Thank you very much. Well, I'm very happy to be here today. And what I wanted to share with you was actually my personal story of trying to get my mind around the issue of social norms and applying it to programming. Because I think in the story of my personal odyssey is one which reflects sort of what we have as a field gone through in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, as the language and some of the theory of social norms has penetrated and become part of the discourse on different topics of international development. So can you do the first slide, please? So I put this for a bit of levity to start because it's actually a slide that I borrowed from Ben Chislagi, my colleague, and he has an amazing ability to find these pictures which reflect at their most basic sort of the key insight of social norms. So basically, social norms are just rules of behavior and sort of normal behavior or behavior in a social context. And I think that we oftentimes can end up complicating the concept, but really we're all familiar with it, with the idea of why sometimes we do things because we see those around us doing them. Next slide. So when I first came to the issue of social norms, I actually worked on what I was used to calling gender norms. And this came from my work for years and years in the field of sexual and reproductive health and the feminist movement, and work on trying to transform what we at the time called inequitable gender norms. There was a lot of discussion in the 90s and the 2000s around the power imbalance between men and women and gender-related power imbalances and their implications for family planning use, for HIV prevention, and the like. That actually was a stream of thought which was quite separate from one which I encountered as I got to know actually Ben Chislagi, who you'll hear from next, who came from a tradition and a theoretical perspective on social norms. And it raised the question in my own head, well, they're talking about norms slightly different than we do with respect to gender norms in a much more kind of specific, and at the time I used the term disciplined way. And this was the kind of discussion that was being introduced around thinking about problems in the development sphere like early marriage, female genital cutting, and violence. And so I started this on an odyssey to figure out, well, is there something from the theory of social norms and from an academic perspective that could actually help us program better in the space of changing these harmful practices? Next. What I learned is actually, as I delved deep into the issues around social norms, is that there were actually lots of different traditions, from moral philosophy to social psychology to economics to feminist and gender theory, that dealt with the notion of norms. And actually, they tended to define and even understand what norms were differently. The perspective that seemed to have gripped the imagination of the folks in international development was that from the social psychology. And if you look at the bottom of the slide here, the typical thing that you see in terms of a definition of social norms from psychology is it's a shared, often implicit, social rule that people conform to because either it's typical or it's considered appropriate or expected. And you'll see these two terms which frequently pop up, which is either the idea of a descriptive norm, meaning that which other people are doing and describes their behavior, or an injunctive norm, meaning that there's actually some expectation attached to that. Next slide, please. And there's three sort of important features that you see in the kind of social psychology approach to norms. One is the idea that norms are beliefs about others' behaviors, and what the expectations of others are. They also exist within what has been termed reference groups, meaning that you're actually looking and considering your own behavior in comparison to those around you. And those reference groups can vary. Sometimes a norm can be so ubiquitous in a cultural setting that it's actually a norm of that entire community or setting. Sometimes, though, smaller groups of people can establish norms. So, for example, there may be one set of behaviors that your faith community expects of you, which might be very different than what your peers may accept or expect of you. And therefore, the notion of reference group is useful for programming because it directs your attention to thinking about, well, who is it who is actually influencing the outcome and the behavior of the group that we're trying to change. And oftentimes it can be more than one group. It can be contextual. So, for example, if you're thinking about sexual behavior of an adolescent, again, the messages and the expected behavior may be very different in the family from their parents than from their peers. And finally, there is this concept of sanctions, which is the idea that oftentimes, although not always, norms are held in place and sort of solidified through either approval or disapproval of others. So sometimes we do things because we know it will gain us status or approval or belonging, and that's a very strong motivator. Other times we may not do something because we know that it would be frowned upon, or we would be ostracized, or people would gossip about our behavior. Next. So when I encountered this approach to norms, one of the things that occurred to me is there were aspects of the discourse and the understanding of norms from the gender space that really were not discussed in the social psychology space. And one of the key factors there is the issue of the role that power plays in social relations. So when feminists and in the sexual reproductive health community talks about gender norms, we're often talking about the issue of how power circulates between men and women. We also saw that it underplays, or there's very little discussion about the role that childhood socialization plays and other motivations for norms compliance or other mechanisms for inculcating and maintaining norms other than the approval and disapproval mechanism that we talked about before. A further area that seemed to be a big divergence is that the concept of gender norms very much talks about how norms both can become embedded in institutions. And what I mean by that is is that if a norm is at play, it frequently both gets reproduced and is reflected in social institutions. So for example, if we say there is a norm that men are the providers and their role is to provide economically for the family, and the expectation is that women will provide childcare and in the domestic sphere, what you see is that becomes reflected throughout different structures of society. So, for example, in national accounts of governments, because the male role of economic providership is valued over that of the domestic sphere, it's counted and it's actually assigned an economic value in gross domestic product, for example, whereas domestic labor is not. So that's just an example of talking about how norms become embedded and reproduced through institutions. And finally, another area that seemed to be missing in some of the discourse from social psychology was how norms get produced and reproduced through daily interaction. And this is something you see a lot in the gender literature, how people will demonstrate or express or perform their masculinity or their femininity, or trying to conform to expectations around gender. And in so doing, they are actually recreating those expectations. And finally, I think one of the challenges that we were grappling with is that the issue around the social psychological approach to norms tends to focus on norms as they exist at the interpersonal level, rather than, again, the more systemic or structural change and the interrelationship between things like laws and policy and how that actually interacts with the interpersonal and actually helps enforce or create normative expectations. Next, please. So just briefly, if you think, one of the things that came to us as we were, and when I say we, it was actually Ben Chislagi and I who were working together trying to understand these different traditions. And rather than the gender norms position being undisciplined or sort of less fulsome than the cognitive, we realized that actually they just came out of two different streams of sociological thought, or of social science thought. So the sociological approach to norms basically sees norms as existing sort of outside of the individual, but they can be internalized, and that they're learned through instruction, the media, role models, and they become ingrained in institutions and social relations. The cognitive approach basically sees social norms or conceptualize them as beliefs that exist in the mind. And this is actually an animated slide, so I'm going to ask you to click a few times to get the rest of it up there. Go ahead. One more. Okay. So if you look at this, what you see is that there is a whole tradition in social science out of sociology, gender and development, and anthropology on the left-hand side of your screen that really is quite consistent with the discourse and the understanding of norms that came out of the gender norms discourse. And then there's another set of social science explorations, game theory, behavioral economics, social psychology, that really informed the social psychological approach of social norms existing in the mind. And it's not that one is right and the other is wrong, it's that it's dealing with norms at different levels, and they both bring different things to our discussion and our understanding. Next slide. So what we've been trying to do in the Learning Collaborative, as well as across the work that we've been doing another project called Strive, and in just our work in conceptualizing norms in the development space, is sort of bring these two traditions together. And this is a series of observations that are now on the Align network, which is where we host a lot of the materials that have come out of the Learning Collaborative, as well as additional ones. And so our revised proposal for understanding social norms, including gender norms, is that they're implicit, informal rules that most people accept and follow. They're influenced by belief systems, economic context, and often the perceived rewards and sanctions for adhering to them and or disobeying. So what we've added here is more the notion of the context, that they can be embedded in formal and informal institutions and reproduced or produced through social interaction, and that they change when enough people choose to act or actually are compelled to act through the imposition of power or law in a different way, which can create a new norm. Next. So this is something from the document, and I'm not going to go through it in great detail given the time constraints, but I find it very helpful. And it's an effort to really lay out some of the insights of what has been learned about normative change at a community level. So some of the key things, just briefly to go through, is to recognize and confront power imbalances, and that we cannot ignore power in our efforts to think about norms. At a community level, we've had a lot of success with creating safe spaces for critical reflection. Norms often reflect deeply held values in a community, and therefore attacking them from the outside oftentimes is not an effective strategy. It's much more effective to pose questions that cause groups of people to reconsider the origins of the behavior and other ways to honor the deeper values that they hold dear. That's the third one, is rooting it within this community's own value system. Another thing that we've seen is that oftentimes we go wrong because we're actually making assumptions about which norms are most at play. And you'll hear some examples about in Samata, where I think part of where we went wrong in the very early days is we thought that one norm or one set of beliefs was what was really driving the behavior, and realized that actually we were working on the wrong norm. And so accurately assessing upfront exactly what is the set of beliefs and norms is incredibly important. And future parts of the webinar will actually give us information on how to do that well.
Laurie, yep. Sorry, I need to ask you to stop.
That's fine. I'm done anyway, so I will go on. People go on.
Shall I?
Yep.
Thank you so much. That was an extremely clear presentation about social norms embedded in their formal and informal structures and systems. I would like to now give the floor to our next speaker, Ben Chislagi. He leads a team of researchers and activists working at the intersection between gender equality, child protection, and ethics of international development. His research aims to collaborate with NGOs to increase their self-reflective ethical practices and integrate greater understanding of gender and social norms into their work. Ben?
Thank you,
Over
Clara.
to you.
Thank you. And I see so many names of people that I've met before. I tried to actually chat to say hi to all of you, but our chat is disabled, so I'll take advantage of this for seconds to say hi. So what I will be doing in the next 8 slides is to look at some, let's call them insights, or into how the translation of social norms theory into practice needs to be informed by awareness of possible advantages, benefits, and pitfalls in applying social norms theory. So the first one, in the next slide, speaks to the idea that, to the tendency in international development to pathologize culture, and as we otherize it. So a lot of the interventions that are designed in international development tend to scavenge eagerly for problems, because that's what drives the donor windmill. So the more problems we find, the more we are needed. So the first insight instead is that cultures are spaces, of course, and every geographical space is a space of problems, but it's also a space of solutions. And there are a lot of things that are actually going well. Among these things, social norms can also play a role in protecting people from violence, exploitation, inequality. So they don't obligatory do so, but you might have certain norms that already are operative in the context where you're carrying out your intervention, that you can leverage as you design and implement an intervention. So an example of a protective social norm might be real men never hit their spouses. And then yet you might have violence because that norm is not operative, but you might strengthen it. So just norms are not only harmful, they can also be protective. The second insight, in the next slide, is about the relation that Laurie kind of mentioned, is about the relation between social norms and other factors that sit on this revised version of this evolution, as we like to call it, of the ecological and socio-ecological model that Professor Meher put forward. So what we did here was overlapping 4 domains of influence. So that includes factors of influence over a certain practice: the institutional domain, laws and policies; the individual domain, knowledge and skills; the social domain, family configuration, and for instance, and then the material domain, the resources, services, infrastructure, etc., etc. And these are embedded within this gender dynamic and health outcomes that surround them all, but they also intersect in ways that shape power relations that are then locked in place by social and gender norms. So what does that mean in practice as we design an intervention? Well, as we design an instance, increase access to contraception, we might tackle the institutional aspect of it, where the law allows adolescents to obtain contraception without their parents' authorization. We might tackle the resource factors, access to hospitals, but at that very intersection between the law and the application of the law, sit norm that might influence the doctors are ready or not to meet the desire expressed by adolescents for contraception. And they might refuse and send adolescents away, especially in places where there is little control. So really the embedment of social norms. The third insight is on the fact that not all norms have the same strength. And this is really an attempt to clarify or simplify a very fragmented discipline where words and titles and mention and construct vary from norms to conventions to. But here's a simplified version of understanding how social norms can affect behavior. And this little spectrum says certain norms can make something obligatory in ways that you have no other choice but comply and conform with the norm, unless you take a huge risk. An example is that if you're the only parents in town who doesn't cut their daughter, she might never, all the other parents might come after you and kick you out and or come and kill you. But then there are norms that are weaker. An appropriate norm is if you want to look cool with your friends, you need to smoke. Nobody's going to come after you if you don't. And then tolerated and possible. So there are ways of understanding how, and the learning collaborative has put forward some diagnostic tools to help us understand how different strengths of norms can affect different practices. The next insight, the fourth, or the next feature of social norms, is about the alignment of norms and attitudes. While attitudes are one person's internal preference or like towards something, for instance, I like ice cream, or I want to wear jeans, I like wearing jeans. Social norms are obviously an outside influence, but nobody wears jeans, and so I don't. In international development, there is a tendency to look at harmful norm with the assumption that people do want to do the right thing, so that their attitudes are protected. And that's a very seducing space of work, because when that is the case, well, then you just need to dismantle the false perception and reveal that actually most people want to do the right thing. But that's just one of the many ways in which norms and attitudes can interact. Sometimes, as you see in the second column, people want to, I don't know, want to cut their daughters, want to marry their daughters off when they're children, and they think there's an expectation for them to do so. Or other times they might want to marry off their daughter, but the norm is saying that if they did so, everyone will consider them bad parents. So the norm is protected. So different alignments. The fifth insight, the fifth feature of social norms is on, and I'll wait for the slide because I don't quite remember. Oh, yes. Oh, well, Laurie mentioned this. So this is actually a study that Holly Shaki and colleagues did in Honduras, in India, about the ownership of latrines. And one thing that they found is that they initially started with the idea that the reference group might overlap with the community of residents. But what they really did find through social network analysis is that all those little squares, those are people with latrines, were connected across villages. And all those circles, that is people without latrines, were also connected. So the reference group influencing who had a latrine was really not overlapping just with geographical context. So there are different reference groups, and once again, the Learning Collaborative has put forward methods to understand them. Next slide. Moving on close to the end of my part. This is actually something that I care about quite a bit. Power holders may resist or support change, and this has practical implication. The last example is those are two children bowing to a female elder in Nigeria. So that means, obviously, as Laurie was saying, that we do need to understand how to engage power holders in the movement for changing norms. But then this also has implication at the strategic level. And this is why there is a small UNICEF picture in there. So while on the one hand, we are very aware of how power holders can hold biases that are harmful, we spend less time understanding our role as power holders and our biases and the norms that exist within the international development system, and how those norms might actually help work against our desire to achieve social change, be it in the incentive system, be it in the structures that transform global narratives into local practices. So both at the programmatic and at the international level, we need to be aware of this. The second last slide of mine on the 17th site is that pretty everywhere you will find holders of positive deviant attitudes. The so-called communities are not uniform blobs, non better specified, but they hold communities within communities where you have people holding different opinions, people having desire for change. And in this picture, you see a man cleaning the village, which is usually a woman's job. So then in your intervention, finding who those people are and finding how you can engage them and ally with them in the movement of social change becomes critical. And lastly, an ethical point, which is about the expansion of agency. And we often, so the work on social norms calls for a lot of reflection on whose norms we are influencing. And at that tension of, well, we don't want to impose norms in culturally unfamiliar contexts, at that tension, one way of escaping that is always to say, well, let's increase people's agency, so that individual and collective, so that they can achieve things that matter to them. And I'm all happy with it. The problem is that sometimes our measurement techniques and our programmatic strategies only consider successes when people use their agency to do things that matter to us. So there is an assumption that expanding agency would achieve positive outcomes. That might not be the case. And so that requires for an understanding of how agency operates in a system of norms, or what to do when people essentially want to use their agency to do things different from what we would hope they did.
Ben.
And that's it.
On that important note, I need to give the floor. Thank you so, so much. And I need to give the floor to Parinita Bhattacharjee, Senior Technical Advisor at the University of Manitoba. The floor to you, Parinita.
Thank you so much, Clara. Hello, everyone. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share our experience of implementing some of the project in Karnataka. Karnataka is a southern state in India, and my focus would be to share how we use norms-related research and findings to make mid-course correction and intervention. Next slide, please. The project Samatha was implemented in 2 northern districts of Karnataka, namely Bagalkote and Bijapur. These districts are some of the poorest districts in Karnataka. The districts have very high population of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe populations. These are officially designated groups of historically disadvantaged people in India. And secondary school dropouts among girls were much higher in these 2 districts compared to the state average, and age at marriage was also lower. So Project Samatha, which was designed to be implemented for 4 years, from 2013 to 2017, had the objective to increase the proportion of adolescent girls who enter formal secondary education, who complete 10th standards, delay marriage until after 10th standard, and also delay their sexual debut. Primary education in India is free and compulsory, and we found that even in these districts, a very high proportion of girls were enrolled in primary school. The challenge was when girls had to transition from primary school to secondary schools, many dropped out. We worked with 3,600 adolescent girls from SC/ST community in 119 villages. The project was a multi-level project and proposed reducing negative gender norms among boys and girls, building sense of agency among girls, improving academic performance, reducing economic dependence on girls' labor, and making schools responsive to the needs of girls. And we believe that in combination, it all would reduce a dropout of girls from school, secondary school, and delay their marriage. The intervention was designed largely focusing on the girls, but also their families and communities that they live in, boys within their families and the community, and schools where the girls go to. We had planned Samatha as a norm change intervention, as Laurie had mentioned before, and because we did believe that norm change is important to achieve the objectives that the project had set out to. And our assumption initially was that gender and social norms around getting girls married early and not sending girls for higher education were the main norms, were the stronger norms. And we believe that these norms kind of impact each other. Girls drop out from school to get married, or early marriage leads to school dropout. Next slide, please. As this was also an evaluation project, our initial days were spent conducting quantitative surveys, and we included questions to understand norms influencing the practice of early marriage and dropout for girls. We found out through the surveys that at least the families reported that they actually supported higher education among girls and thought that the girls should get married as late as possible. So we were a bit confused, as even though people had these norms, at least the research showed girls were still dropping out from secondary education and getting married early. As Ben mentioned, that not all norms have the same strength. So it seemed that norms that we were actually focusing on may not be the strongest norms that have the strongest influence on outcomes. We got better sense of the norms that influence child marriage or early marriage and school dropout through actually our qualitative research and program reviews. We conducted program reviews annually where we would speak to different stakeholders, including girls, their families, and the community, and got a good sense of what people thought or what influenced their practices. We found that there were actually two interrelated stronger norms that influence behavior of early marriage and school dropout. And that was related to girls' sexual purity and again related to family honor. As girls reach menarche, parents started getting concerned about their sexual purity. There's a fear that girls will start engaging in romantic relationship with boys, or if they talk to boys on their way to school, they will be perceived by others to be having a romantic or sexual relationship. This unwanted sexual attention by boys may initiate rumors about girls or may even encourage the girls to get in romantic relationship that would lead to the family losing their reputation or honor, as girls who engage in romantic or sexual relationship before marriage are not perceived as good girls. So this fear of loss of purity, sexual purity of girls that is attached to, again, family reputation, led actually restriction in girls' mobility and withdrawing them from schools. Families believed that marrying her early seemed to be another option to ensure that she was not available for such relationships with boys and is committed to a husband and a family. The other norm was around gender roles, where girls were expected to play domestic and caring roles in preparation for marriage. So missing school to focus on domestic work, where there is need, was an acceptable thing because girls' education was not considered as a priority compared to boys. Next slide, please. However, as mentioned earlier by the two presenters, Laurie and Ben, the norms are not operating on their own, and we did find that there were various other structural factors that had positive or negative influence on these norms. If families had high educational aspiration for their girls, and we found families where at least one parent had some education, did have high aspiration for girls, or there was an open communication with daughters, and there was a relationship of trust where parents believed what their daughters said more than the neighbors or other people in the community, then parents were willing and able to resist the pressures of the social sanctions and even create new norms. However, in families which were poor, were dysfunctional, like the father was drunk most of the time, or mother had died, or where there was school performance of girls were not good, then girls were prioritized for domestic chores, and families invested more intensely actually in enforcing correct performance of gender roles, and marriage seems to be a way to secure her future. Next slide, please. So with this understanding, the new understanding of what specific norms had stronger influence on people's behavior, we actually redesigned the program. The first thing that we did is, I must acknowledge the role of the outreach workers in the project who facilitated these changes. The workers were women from the same community and from the same context in many times. They understood the realities in the community and were the change agents. So what we did was we supported the outreach workers to understand norms around honor, around sexual purity, and had several training sessions to unpack it and understand how to address it in the midway of the intervention. Based on their suggestions, we also revised other parts of the intervention. One of the interventions with the girls was actually reflection sessions. We had started Parivartan groups. Parivartan means change, where they underwent a curriculum-based facilitated reflective discussion on issues related to gender, marriage, school. And they found these groups very, very empowering. So we used those spaces to add new sessions in the curriculum, focusing on sexual purity, honor, and its impact on girls.
Sunita, apologies for interrupting, but we need to give the floor to, sorry, Parinita, to Sunita.
Great, thanks. So I just wanted to conclude by saying there were various other changes that we made in the program, but at the same time also made some changes in the structural interventions, like linking girls to schemes, school performances, extra tuitions, to address some of the norms that we learned in midway. Thank you so much, Clara.
Thank you so much for being so disciplined. I know it's a challenge to pack so much in 7 minutes, but so now I would like to give the floor to Sunita Menon. As I said at the beginning, she's the Senior Director of Content and Design from Breakthrough. Sunita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clara. Hello, everyone. My name is Sunita and I represent Breakthrough. We are a human rights organization working to end violence against women and girls. And we do that by changing the gender and social norms around it. In 2008, we started a 360-degree campaign called Bell Bajao, which called on men and boys to take a stance against domestic violence. And Breakthrough had been working on the issue of domestic violence for many years, and we did an extensive research, formative research and baseline, which threw up several norms around domestic violence. And I'm not going to go through everything, but I'll highlight a couple of them, where it was broadly found that a lot of people found domestic violence to be a private matter, and therefore they could not intervene because it was a family affair. People resisted intervening in a domestic violence situation because they felt that there would be a backlash and they would be stigmatized. The third thing which kind of came into being was a lot of blame was put on the woman. If there was violence within the marriage, it was seen as her responsibility to save marriage. And broadly, men were viewed as three different categories: those who were violent, a few who did act, and a majority who were the bystanders and who did nothing about domestic violence. Interestingly, attitude-wise, both men and women had equal propensity to take action in domestic violence case. Next slide, please. It was clear from the research and experience that the power rested within the man in a patriarchal setup. And in the absence of structural support system like shelter homes or speedy justice system, we had to address the community to halt domestic violence and be the support system for women. So the entire messaging focused on men and boys as critical partners, actors, and leaders in ending domestic violence, and shifting their role from being a bystander to those who are preventing domestic violence. Interestingly, it was also the time when a new law around protection of women from Domestic Violence Act 2005 had been passed by the Parliament. And we felt that it would be a good space to create awareness and demand generation on the law. So when we designed the program messaging, we decided that it had to be a simple, actionable message which connected with people. So we designed an advertisement called Bell Bajao, Bring Domestic Violence to a Halt. Bell Bajao also means ring the bell. So the ad, which I have shared a link to in the latest slide, did three things. One, it gave perpetrators a clear message that domestic violence was not acceptable. The second thing which it did was it gave a message to the survivors saying that they were not alone and that they could seek out help from people around them. And third, it gave a lot of power to the bystanders, the men and women, the community people, to go and ring the bell and do it in a way which is non-threatening and yet made a point saying that violence against women was not acceptable. Now, this message, I'm going on despite the presentation not being online, because I feel we have a very short time, so I'll just continue.
Yeah, thank you, Sunita. That's great. Sorry.
So what we did was by using these, the norms which influenced and the messaging that we developed, we converted them into multiple forms to reach out multiple stakeholders. We created television, radio, print ads, billboards for awareness and demand generation. And in other forms, we layered the messaging with more detail, which questioned and challenged norms through community mobilization and leadership training. Now, it was also interesting because we as an organization were very clear that we wanted a program which achieved scale as well as depth. And being a small organization, there was only so much that you could do. So we decided to partner with the best in the industry. So for example, we tied up with Ogilvy and Mather to create the advertisement, and it went on to win a lot of awards, including the Silver Lion at Cannes. We partnered with a whole lot of Hindi cinema actors and actresses and Hollywood actors and actresses. And they endorsed our campaign and they brought in their own fan following with them who followed the campaign. We partnered with Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India, to disseminate the advertisements that we had created in mainstream television, radio. And through them, we reached a whopping 130 million viewers across the country. And when we do this kind of dissemination, what was invariable was there would be an increase in demand for casework, legal, medical, counseling aid. So for that, we tied up with local civil society organizations and service providers at the state level where we were working to make sure that the women got these services if they reached out to them. And this was integral to risk mitigation, because we did not want women to go and access these laws and face a backlash from either their families or the system. We also tied up with UN Women, and where we took the campaign global. Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General, was the brand ambassador. It became a global campaign. We also trained a whole lot of organizations across South Asia to look at the message of Bell Bajao and implement it in their intervention areas. The campaign was finally, the media campaign got so many eyeballs that it was adopted and adapted by 7 countries across the globe in their local languages with their local actors, keeping the same message. And it was done in China, Pakistan, Sweden, Canada, Kenya, and many more. Next, please. Next slide. These are some of the photographs from the intervention. So besides the scale of operations that we was talking about through the media campaign, we also wanted a lot of sustainability for the program. And for that, we worked across multiple levels. So in the earlier slide, you would have seen that we worked with individual men and women, and we built the agency and empowered them to not take violence. We worked with the family and institutional setups to make sure that there was a support system which was created in and around them. And we created a larger enabling environment in the community on gender and social norms and how to break them. And for each of these, just a slide up, please. The earlier slide, please. We used different strategies to address all of these levels. So we worked from individual to family to institution to community. And to address each of these stakeholders, we used different methodologies. So we used mass media to make sure that domestic violence was made into a public agenda. Earlier, it was seen as private affair, and how we kind of made it into a public agenda issue. The second thing which we used was community mobilization, where we used events and video vans and things like that. And we generated public debate around the issue. Over 200,000 people engaged in community mobilization. We also got a lot of positive deviant stories in these programs.
Sunita, sorry to interrupt again, but we do need to leave some minutes for questions.
Okay, can I just wrap it up?
Yes, quickly,
okay.
Please.
So all of these strategies, next please, slide. Can we go to the last slide, please? So what this entire program managed to do was we increased the knowledge and understanding of domestic violence. Was seen more, not just physical, but mental, emotional, financial. Marital rape was recognized for the first time. 90% of respondents favored taking legal action in case of domestic violence. Nearly 61% respondents in the community reported that the community had taken action to stop it. And there was a decrease in people who thought domestic violence was a private affair. So in short, Bell Bajao captured the imagination of people, and it became a part of day-to-day life. I have shared some links in the next slide. It includes the advertisement, the case study, and our global launch. Please do refer to them. They're very interesting and have a lot of learning in them. Thanks, Clara. Over to you now.
Thank you so much. And yes, I do recommend looking at those videos from Bell Bajao are really worth, and the links are there. So thanks everyone, and thanks to the speakers. We have a few time for questions, and we can extend for those who want to stay. We have like 90 participants. online. So if you have questions, please do write to them in the chat. I will read them and direct them to the speakers if they are specifically directed. So let me read you, Ben, a first question for you. It's from Cheryl. How can international development organizations and actors better recognize our own roles as power holders whose norms and attitudes might be getting in the way of our intended outcomes?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sherry. It's a great question. I think we need reflective practices within organizations, and that's kind of, some of that is what I try to do, especially with donor agencies, but also with NGOs. So I think we need, within interventions, we need to take the time for inception phases where we understand the context and we allow the context to contradict us. The problem is that in the, as Laurie calls it, in the development juggernaut that grinds people to make money, we don't have the time to do the kind of understanding that KHPT and Breakthrough just spoke about very often. Or sometimes interventions are implemented by international NGOs who don't have an understanding of the context. So I think we need to allow ourselves to be surprised by the context and to think without a parapet. So to think that maybe sometimes we are wrong, but then we need to create procedures and systems of incentives. And that's where the norm of intervention development becomes a problem. So we have norms within organizations that then become an obstacle to effectiveness, I think.
Thank you, Ben. Maaike van Veen asks Laurie whether you could explain the last slide. It was, Maaike, could you specify maybe your question about the last slide? Let's see if we can go to that one.
I think she means the one we ended on, which is not the exact, it's further up. Because we didn't, is this next one? Yeah. Is that the one? Yes, this one. I think basically the 2 points that I didn't get to, just briefly, is the use of what were called organized diffusion and creating positive new norms. And you know, they're both important points that you can read more about in the document. But what we mean by organized diffusion is that we tend to do, we know that, for example, that if people work intensively in reflection groups, or you're working with a group over time, it is quite possible within kind of programmatic timeframes to see shifts both in attitudes and even the norms of members within that group. But what we don't see is, without integrating into your plan specific efforts to sort of diffuse that new perspective beyond the group of individuals who, let's say, went through your curriculum or attended some of the community mobilizing events, it's very difficult to have it actually diffuse of its own accord. So that the idea is, if you are doing something in small groups and you hope that it will diffuse to shift norms, you need to pair it with either a mass media strategy like they did in Belle Bojao, or actual efforts of having people serve as change agents to reach out in a more systematic way. So that's what we mean about organized diffusion. You cannot assume that things will just naturally, organically diffuse. And the final is that the observation that is actually quite useful for programming, is that when you're dealing with a very powerful entrenched norm, especially if there's resistance, or if it would go, shifts in that norm would go against power holders, sometimes a more effective strategy is to not try to dismantle that norm, but to create a parallel norm that attracts people to it. So that in effect, you're building on the positive. It's a lot easier to build on the positive and to attract people to new visions and behaviors that actually are kind of reflect shared underlying norms. So, and just a really quick example, you might be working with parents, and they might have a norm of using harsh discipline as a mechanism to ensure obedience. And you, rather than challenging that discipline or that pattern of behavior, you could acknowledge that everyone wants what's best for their children. They want to guide their children. And here's a new set of behaviors that you can use, like nonviolent type approaches to discipline that are more effective and that recognize the value that all parents have for their children.
Thank you very much, Lori. There's another question for Ben, the $1 million question, I think. Thinking about the socio-ecological model, what social norm strategy will be most effective to produce changes in the power holders? This question comes from Modupe Taiwo. Ben?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
Yeah,
Did you hear a question? Yeah.
I think there is no single strategy, and that's kind of the desire, the very understandable desire to find strategies that work across contexts is in itself problematic, because it reduces the time and attention we give to understanding every specific context. But what I've seen working myself in West Africa is to engage power holders in the movement for change, within critical discussions for change. And then when there is a bottom-up critical mass of people who want change, then have them celebrate the power holders as parts of this change, so that the power holders are in this critical position in which their power is threatened, and the only way for them to continue is essentially to let go of some of the power and actually embrace the movement for change.
Thank you, Ben. If there's one last question or few, yes, here so I have a question for Parinita. You mentioned identifying power relations as part of the drivers that held norms in place. Could you tell us in what ways power was addressed in your norm shifting intervention in relation to the questions that were just asked as well? Giving a concrete example might help.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think power relationships in many relationships and in many forms. There was power relationship firstly between parents and the daughters. There was power relationship between the school authorities and the girls, between the boys in the community and the girls. So power was an underlying issue that was dealt with in all the important activities that we did with the girls, with the parents, with the schools, and also boys. But the most impactful one was between the families, the parents, and the girls, where we talked about how do you deal with this through communication, through open communication? How do you build relationship of trust? The girls always had a complaint that when parents see us talking to a boy, or neighbors see us talking to a boy, or a boy teases us, they believe that we are going to run away with the boy. So why can't the parents listen to us, or why can't the parents have a communication to us and believe in what we are saying? So in our girls sessions, we talked about how can we build that open relationship, how do we empower ourselves to talk to our parents in an open way about sensitive issues like relationships. And in our parents sessions, we talked about why is it important to have that communication, and also creating these positive deviants. So parents or families where that open communication was there, presenting them as role models for other people to see that there are options. Parents can actually have open communication with the girls, and they could be positive deviants, and they can become role models to emulate.
Thank you, Parinita. And on the previous point, and again on the importance and on really understanding norms in context, I wanted to highlight a comment that Judy made to everyone on the chat, but she mentions in reference to Laurie's presentation and the anthropological perspective on social norms would generally overlook with more attention, given that psychological and sociological concepts of norms. In the norms discussion, she says it's very important that the specificities of individualist versus collectivist cultures, which is 2/3 of world cultures, be considered given that the individualist relationship to the group differs greatly, and therefore the influence of social norms on individuals within the culture. So again, thank you, Judy, for this point. And it relates to the importance of, again, not wanting single simplistic strategies that apply in different contexts. I think we are almost over time already, so I wanted to thank you enormously to all of the participants that are there and our great 4 speakers, and recalling that a recording of this webinar and the materials discussed here today will be available on the Align platform. You can see the slides there and the link. Stay tuned, because there will be 2 other webinars coming up organized by the other 2 learning collaborative groups on social norms measurement and Scale Up on Norms program. Keep your eyes out for more information on this challenging aspect of social norms. This was just a taster, but there's a lot of materials, and these I do recommend you to look into this new publication, Social Norms, Building a Bridge from Theory to Practice, related to adolescent youth social and reproductive health. So thank you again, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.